If I had known that firing up my ATV on a Saturday morning would trigger a neighborhood-wide meltdown, complete with HOA fines, a screaming woman in a visor, and a petition to preserve trail tranquility, I might have done it louder. The absurdity started when I was halfway through tuning the carb on my Polaris and a pink golf cart screeched to a halt at the edge of my gravel driveway. Out stormed a woman I'd later come to know as Cynthia Walgrave, HOA vice president and self-declared trail guardian, waving her phone like it was a holy artifact. She pointed at my ATV like it had just mugged her poodle. "You're in violation," she declared, breath short from indignation or caffeine. I couldn't tell. I calmly looked over my sunglasses, still holding a wrench in one hand and a bottle of Gatorade in the other, and said, "Violation of what?" "Breathing near your aura." That was apparently the spark she needed to go nuclear. According to Cynthia, there was a clause buried in the HOA's bylaws forbidding recreational off-road vehicles on any residential property adjacent to community trails. Of course, the trail she was talking about was a decades-old easement, one that technically cut across the edge of my private land. For years, the HOA had ignored it, until someone decided to beautify it with mulch, fairy lights, and those little painted rocks with phrases like "Peace lives here." Now, apparently, it was sacred. I told her plainly. My ATV had never touched their stupid trail, and even if it did, it was my property, and I didn't see their names on my tax bill. Her response was to snap a photo of my license plate and announce that I'd be receiving a fine of $1,250 for unauthorized vehicular proximity to a shared asset. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got a certified letter from the HOA. The tone was impressively smug. They referenced documented trail infringement, complete with time-stamped photos and a threat of additional penalties if I didn't cease and desist all mechanical and motorized activity within audible range of the trail system. I laughed for a solid minute. Then I read it again and realized these people were serious. They actually thought they could regulate noise on private land because some hikers might get their chukras misaligned. I decided not to respond immediately. I needed to see how far they'd take it. The answer came in the form of a community-wide email thread a few days later. Cynthia had included me, either by accident or by sheer arrogance, in a BCC message to the Trail Peacekeeping Committee. In it, she described my property as a growing nuisance, accused me of operating an illegal mechanic shop, and suggested that if I couldn't be fined into compliance, perhaps alternative legal remedies could be explored. That was the moment I stopped laughing. They weren't just being annoying, they were strategizing. I replied to the thread with a simple message. Noted. I'll handle this my way. The thing about living on the edge of town is, people forget that zoning lines matter. My property wasn't just a house next to a trail. It was 20 acres of mixed-use land, purchased specifically for its legal ambiguity. I'd filed the original deed under my LLC, a habit I picked up from my years working with land use attorneys and rural zoning boards. Cynthia had no clue who she was playing chicken with, and while I didn't intend to go full scorched earth yet, I figured it was time to show them that I wasn't the one to shove. So the next weekend, I held a little get-together. 5 friends, 4 ATVs, a barbecue pit, and one very large Bluetooth speaker playing classic rock. We didn't touch their trail. Not once. But we made damn sure every engine rev echoed off the ridge and into their garden tea parties. It wasn't malicious, it was acoustics. Naturally, Cynthia showed up again, this time flanked by a wiry man in cargo shorts and an HOA lanyard who introduced himself as Brent, President Pro Tem. He tried to hit me with another fine on the spot, only this time I asked him to show me the jurisdiction. He fumbled with a copy of the HOA's handbook, a spiraled binder that looked like it had been photocopied during the Reagan administration. I asked where in the county zoning code they derived the power to enforce any of it. Brent blinked like I'd just spoken Sanskrit. Cynthia started yelling again about community cohesion and disruption of the vibe. I leaned in close and said, You want quiet? Buy a monastery. This is the countryside. They stormed off in a huff, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time. What I didn't expect was what came next. 3 days later, I found 2 county inspectors on my porch. The HOA had filed a complaint alleging that I was operating unpermitted commercial activity. The inspectors were polite and clearly embarrassed, but they had to follow protocol. After a brief walkthrough and some paperwork, they left, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. They even apologized. One of them said, "Honestly, you're cleaner than most of the farms we check. This looks personal." It was. That night, I started digging. Every HOA has weak points: financials, trail easements, grant misappropriations. It took about 4 hours of county records and public filings to discover the HOA didn't actually own the trail they were so determined to protect. In fact, they'd been maintaining it with money from an old municipal green space grant that had expired 2 years ago. That meant they were technically trespassing and illegally altering private property, including mine. That was the twist I needed. I sent a formal letter to the HOA, citing the expired grant, the lack of land title, and a cease and desist notice for any further trail maintenance on or near my land. I even copied the county clerk. 2 days later, they doubled down. Instead of backing off, they called an emergency HOA meeting to vote on a new trail use ordinance, essentially trying to create their own microlaw banning any vehicle operation within 500 feet of the trail, whether on HOA land or not. The vote passed by one margin, Cynthia's. She held 2 proxy votes from absentee members. I knew because someone from the board, a guy named Terry who was sick of the drama, leaked the meeting minutes to me anonymously. I still have the email. "Dude," it read. "This is getting ridiculous. They're power tripping. Good luck." I didn't need luck. I had leverage, because it just so happened that 2 years ago, I purchased a narrow strip of forested land that ran directly between the trail and the nearest public parking area. It was barely 20 feet wide in places, completely overgrown, and useless for anything, unless you wanted to access the trail from the neighborhood. Without it, the entire HOA trail system became landlocked. They hadn't done their homework, but I had. The moment I realized I owned the only access point to the HOA's precious trail, I sat back in my shop chair and actually muttered, "Oh, this is going to be fun." I'd bought that strip of land on a whim, years ago, during a tax lien auction. It was a sliver nobody wanted, wedged between an old maintenance road and the HOA trailhead, nothing but a drainage gully and some poison ivy. It cost me $500 and a tetanus shot. At the time, I figured maybe I'd clean it up, plant some trees, or use it as a wind buffer. But now? Now it was a guillotine, and I was holding the rope. Before I made a move, I wanted to be precise. I walked the boundary markers, checked the old survey stakes, and confirmed with the county GIS office that my deed clearly outlined ownership. It wasn't just a footpath, it was a legal choke point. The only other entrances to the trail were either blocked by ravines or ran across private land not owned by the HOA. That meant every hiker, dog walker, and pastel sweater-wearing jogger had to cross my land to reach their fairy-lit serenity path. And now I had the receipts to prove it. I didn't post a sign right away. That would have been too direct. I wanted them to move one more piece first. Sure enough, the following Saturday, I noticed a new installation, a decorative wooden arch at the trailhead with a tacky sign reading Cynthia Walgrave Trail, a sanctuary for all. It had a little hummingbird painted in the corner and everything. I stood there staring at it for a full minute. She'd named the trail after herself. That level of ego is rare, even in HOA royalty. I took a photo, just in case I needed more comedic material later, and went home to draft my own announcement. By Monday morning, the neighborhood had a new sign to admire, mine. A bright red and white metal plaque, bolted into a 4x4 post at the beginning of my land, placed right in front of Cynthia's arch. It read, in clean block letters, "Private property, access revoked. No trespassing." Violators will be prosecuted. Beneath that, just for flavor, I added a laminated notice stating the land was under ecological remediation and foot traffic would interfere with native plant restoration. Technically true, poison ivy is native. I installed trail cameras, motion-activated sprinklers, and a little Bluetooth speaker rig that played angry goose honking when someone stepped over the line. The reactions were gold. I watched one dad practically launch himself into a bush when the sprinklers went off. Some woman in yoga pants tried to argue with the speaker. But the best moment came when Cynthia herself arrived, holding a yoga mat and a metal water bottle that probably cost more than my entire trail. She marched right up to the sign, stared at it, then stormed up my driveway like she was about to deliver a TED Talk on entitlement. I met her halfway down the gravel with a cup of coffee and the calmest smile I could muster. "This is a public trail," she barked. "You can't just block it." "Actually," I replied, "you named a trail after yourself that starts on private property you don't own. That's bold. But illegal." She shoved a stack of HOA papers in my direction. "We have easement rights." "Nope," I said, not even glancing at the paperwork. "Your easement expired in 2017. You never renewed the agreement with the county." I checked. She sputtered. "We've been using this path for years." "Cool," I said. "And now you're not." She threatened lawyers. I shrugged. She called me obstructive, selfish, and unreasonable. I told her, "You fined me for owning an ATV. That's not a negotiation tactic. That's a declaration of war." 2 hours later, I got a visit from the local sheriff's deputy. "He's a good guy, Tony. He's dealt with the HOA's nonsense before." He looked sheepish walking up my porch. "Hey man," he said, "just had to check it out. Cynthia says you're harassing people." "Tony," I said, "you want to see the deed?" He held up a hand. "Already pulled it. You're good. She's just loud." That afternoon, the HOA forum lit up like a Christmas tree. Cynthia had made a post about a rogue landowner holding the trail hostage, and claimed I was spitefully endangering community wellness. She even suggested people should exercise civil disobedience by walking the trail anyway. That post didn't last long. Terry from the board deleted it, then posted a follow-up that quietly urged residents to respect evolving access issues and avoid conflict. I guess even he could read a legal map. But Cynthia didn't stop. No, that would require self-awareness. Instead, she tried another angle. A week later, I got a certified letter from a firm called Kellerman & Goss, her cousin's law office. The letter was pure fluff. Vague references to public interest, implied threats of adverse possession claims, and one glorious sentence suggesting I might be guilty of reckless environmental endangerment. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Still, I took it seriously enough to send them a reply, through my own lawyer. Not just any lawyer, mind you. I hired Rachel. Rachel is a land use attorney with a specialty in HOA overreach, and she's an absolute beast in court. She once got a judge to side-eye a board president so hard the guy resigned during the hearing. Rachel wrote a beautiful letter in response, dry, devastating, and dripping with condescension. She cited 4 precedent cases, included a scanned copy of my deed, and offered a subtle warning about potential harassment claims if their nonsense continued. That shut them up. For about 4 days. Then Cynthia tried something truly desperate. She filed for a temporary public access order with the county court, claiming the trail closure was causing mental distress and fitness disruption to the community. She even brought an elderly woman in a wheelchair to the hearing to testify that she could no longer enjoy her daily sunshine routine. Except, plot twist. The woman's own daughter stood up in court and clarified that her mom hadn't used the trail in 3 years and only came because Cynthia offered to pay her utility bill. The judge didn't even have to deliberate. The order was denied on the spot. He told Cynthia, and I quote, "This appears to be a personal dispute disguised as public concern." I suggest you resolve it through appropriate channels, or not at all. Now things were starting to tip. The neighborhood was split. Some were siding with Cynthia, chanting about trail freedom, and trying to frame me as some kind of villainous hermit hoarding nature. Others started realizing how far she'd gone and were embarrassed to be associated with her power trip. I got anonymous thank you notes in my mailbox. One guy even offered to bring me beer just for shutting her up. I declined, but the gesture was appreciated. Then came the final straw. Someone, no doubt acting on Cynthia's orders, tried to cut through my fence one night. They must have thought it would be a quiet act of rebellion. But they didn't count on the infrared trail cams, the motion lights, or the very large sign I'd placed inside the gate that read, "Smile, you're being prosecuted." I didn't press charges. Instead, I printed out a freeze frame from the security footage, face blurred but silhouette obvious, and mailed it to the HOA board with the words, "Next time, bring bolt cutters." And a lawyer. The next day, Terry called me personally. The HOA thought they were dealing with a stubborn homeowner with a vendetta and a loud ATV. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't playing defense anymore. I was about to pull the plug on their entire trail system by using their own legal blind spots against them. It wasn't enough to shut down access to the trailhead. That had made them desperate, sure, but it hadn't made them back off. Cynthia was still prowling through loopholes like a raccoon in a recycling bin, and her little foot soldier Brent was going door to door with flyers trying to rally community resistance. So I decided it was time to make a very public, very legal move that would send a message even they couldn't spin. I began with the county's Department of Environmental Oversight. With a few emails and a couple of in-person conversations, I submitted an official request for ecological reclassification of the land bordering the trail system. It wasn't difficult. The region had recently passed a conservation initiative that rewarded landowners for converting recreational easements into protected habitat corridors. Translation: if your land bordered sensitive ecosystems, wetlands, bird sanctuaries, wildflower preserves, you could apply to have it declared off-limits to vehicles and heavy foot traffic. And guess what the HOA trail ran through? All three. The very landscaping they'd done to make the trail more appealing, bird feeders, hummingbird stations, butterfly gardens, ironically made it qualify as an ecological microhabitat. I didn't even have to lie. All I did was help the county realize what was already true. Within 2 weeks, a notice was posted in the HOA newsletter, probably thanks to Terry, who had clearly switched sides. It read, "Pending review, trail system subject to habitat evaluation. Use with caution." Cynthia lost her mind. She blasted out a thread on the community forum titled "Ecological Tyranny," where she accused me of weaponizing conservation and claimed I was part of a deep green conspiracy. I almost printed it out and framed it. The real cherry on top, though, was when the county confirmed the designation and posted a formal ban on all motorized vehicles, including maintenance carts, within 150 feet of the trail corridor. And since the trail was technically on unowned easement land crisscrossing multiple parcels, that meant nobody, especially not the HOA, could legally operate any kind of vehicle to maintain it. No mulch deliveries. No lawn crews. No decorative benches with commemorative plaque. Nothing. The HOA's landscapers packed up and left after one warning from the county. Cynthia tried to rally volunteers, but that backfired when someone tripped over an exposed root and threatened to sue. Soon, the trail began to overgrow. The carefully curated flower beds wilted. The painted rocks faded. The hummingbird feeders went dry. And that ridiculous arch with Cynthia's name on it? It started to lean sideways like a metaphor written by karma itself. But that wasn't enough for me. Not yet. I filed a motion with the county requesting a barrier installation along the former entry path, on my land. I didn't need a wall or a gate. I just needed to make sure no one could claim accidental access. I submitted a request for a natural obstruction, a fancy term for planting very dense, very legal hedgerows and native thorn bushes that would block the trail like a botanical no trespassing sign. It was approved. I planted it myself. With help from a friend who owned a landscaping business, we laid out rows of native blackthorn, wild rose, and elderberry, all arranged in a winding thicket with no clear break. It was beautiful and impenetrable. I took pictures, posted them online, tagged the HOA in a post that read, "Restoring native growth along my property line. Happy to support our local ecology." The replies were glorious. Most people clapped. Some complained. Cynthia reposted it with the caption, "Hostile landscaping, is this the future of neighborhoods?" I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The comments roasted her for me. And then came her biggest, most public meltdown yet. At the next HOA meeting, held at the community clubhouse, I decided to show up. I'd never attended one before. I wore jeans, a collared shirt, and brought a folder of paperwork. I didn't speak until they opened the floor for community input. Cynthia spotted me instantly and scowled like she'd bitten into a lemon rind. When my turn came, I walked up to the microphone, nodded politely, and calmly laid out everything: the expired trail easement, the lack of legal maintenance rights, the newly approved habitat protections, and the state-level conservation funding that now made any challenge to the closure a potential environmental violation. Then I dropped the final piece. The trail is now designated as a passive-access ecological corridor, I said, which means it cannot legally support any vehicles, including those operated by the HOA for events, cleanups, or monitoring. Furthermore, since portions of the trail cross private property without active easement agreements, any continued usage could constitute trespassing. The room was dead silent. I could feel Brent trying to melt into his chair. Cynthia stood up, red-faced and shaking. "You're destroying our community." "No," I replied evenly. "I'm preserving my land and following the law. You're the ones who forgot to read the fine print." The board didn't argue. They couldn't. One of them, a woman named Gloria, actually thanked me for bringing clarity to the legal mess they'd inherited. Another board member made a motion to formally discontinue HOA responsibility for the trail. It passed. Just like that, the HOA officially abandoned its beloved trail. Cynthia stormed out before the vote was over, practically foaming at the mouth. You'd think that would be the end of it. But Cynthia had one more act left in her disaster opera. About a week later, I noticed a community rally being organized at the far end of the trail, on land adjacent to another private parcel. The flyers said it was a walk for freedom, meant to reclaim public space from private tyranny. I nearly choked laughing. Cynthia had rebranded herself as some kind of HOA Joan of Arc. Of course, I didn't stop it. I didn't need to. Because the land where they planned to rally? It belonged to a retired veteran named Curtis who hated the HOA more than I did. Curtis had sued them twice over tree trimming ordinances and once for trying to dictate the height of his mailbox. I called him up and asked if he knew about the rally. He didn't. But when I told him, his exact words were, "Hell no, they're not touching my land. I'll bring the sprinklers and the goats." Curtis didn't just show up. He parked a tractor in front of the old trail access, turned on the irrigation system, and let his goats roam freely along the path. I arrived with my lawn chair and a cold drink, just in time to watch Cynthia and her dozen followers show up in coordinated t-shirts, only to be met with mud, goats, and the unmistakable smell of agricultural justice. She screamed at Curtis. He turned the sprinklers on her. I took a picture. That image went viral in the local Facebook group. Cynthia mid-screech, soaked to the bone, surrounded by curious goats nibbling on protest signs. The caption someone added was perfect: "Trails closed, Karen." 3 months passed, and for the first time in years, my land was exactly what I'd intended it to be when I bought it: quiet, peaceful, and 100% mine. No hikers peeking over fences, no HOA reps wandering around pretending they owned the soil under my boot. The birds had come back, the blackberries were blooming again, and my ATV roared through the fields without a single HOA fine hanging over my head. But despite the tranquility, I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Because even though Cynthia had been publicly drowned by sprinklers and goats, the HOA had left something behind, a bitter little reminder of the mess they caused. The fine. The original $1,250 fine for vehicular proximity to a shared asset was still on the books. Terry, to his credit, had tried to make it go away. He emailed me personally with a kind of half-apology and said the board was willing to waive all outstanding citations in light of recent misunderstandings. It was clearly an olive branch. But I didn't want an olive branch. I wanted something more permanent. Waiving a fine didn't mean it couldn't come back. All it would take was one new power-hungry Karen to get elected, flip a couple votes, and suddenly I'd be back in kangaroo court with Brent 2.0 telling me I owed back penalties for existing. So instead of accepting the waiver, I wrote back, "Thanks, Terry. But I'm going to appeal it formally. I'd like to set precedent." That's when I began building the trap. HOAs are paper tigers, scary looking until you realize their teeth are just words stapled together. But if you can get those words contradicted in writing, in public, and preferably in front of witnesses, the tiger deflates fast. So I filed a formal appeal to the HOA's Architectural Review Board. The board, surprised anyone even knew they had an appeals process, scheduled a hearing. It was to be held in the clubhouse on a Sunday afternoon. They probably assumed I'd show up with a folder of complaints and a bad attitude. Instead, I brought a lawyer, a zoning consultant, a neighbor who'd worked in municipal code enforcement, and 3 local ATV enthusiasts who lived just outside the HOA boundary. They weren't even in the association, but I had them give sworn statements anyway. My presentation took 20 minutes. It included GPS maps, sound studies, land records, and a flowchart titled Legal Overreach Timeline. I broke down the entire saga from the initial complaint to the environmental reclassification, and even played audio from Cynthia's public accusation that I was a one-man motorized blight. The room was uncomfortably quiet when I finished. Then my lawyer stood up and handed the board a letter. In it, she stated clearly that unless the fine was formally repealed and declared null in the record, we'd be filing a civil suit for damages, citing defamation, harassment, and attempted regulatory abuse. She wasn't bluffing. After a tense sidebar, the board voted unanimously to repeal the fine, permanently, and issue a formal statement acknowledging my compliance with all HOA bylaws and local ordinances. That wasn't just a win. That was legal precedent. Any future HOA drama involving noise, trails, or vehicle complaints would have to reckon with what just happened. But I still wasn't satisfied. Because I didn't just want my name cleared. I wanted the trail, what was left of it, retired in the most poetic, ridiculous, and satisfying way possible. I wanted to bury it so far into the past that not even a new HOA regime could resurrect it. That's when I remembered the community's annual spring festival. Every year, the HOA held a little event in the park to promote neighborhood togetherness. It had been mostly innocuous in years past, some food trucks, face painting, and a few awkward conversations over lemonade. But this year, thanks to Cynthia's very public implosion and the chaos that followed, the event had been quietly cancelled. Too much drama, not enough morale. So I proposed a replacement. I approached Terry and suggested we do something different. Something to reconnect the community with nature, as I put it. My idea? Host a one-day educational event about the region's native habitats, complete with guided walks, bird-watching, and ecological awareness booth. Terry, who was desperate for a win after months of scandal, jumped at it. I told him I'd organize the entire thing. All I asked for was the venue, and permission to rename the event. He agreed, probably assuming I'd call it something boring like EcoFest. Instead, I called it Trails End, a farewell to the path. Flyers went up across the neighborhood. Curious residents signed up for guided tours. A couple of the local schools even got involved. I recruited naturalists from the county extension office, borrowed some tents and tables, and coordinated with a local raptor rescue group to do a falconry demonstration. It looked, on the surface, like a community learning event. But the real centerpiece was the trail burial ceremony. I set it up at the original trailhead, now blocked by my hedgerow and thorn thicket. I brought in a small stage, a podium, and a plaque covered in a black cloth. As people gathered, I gave a short speech, just 5 minutes long. I talked about the importance of respecting nature, of leaving things better than we found them, and of learning when to let go. Then I pulled the cloth off the plaque. It read, "Here lies the Cynthia Walgrave Trail. May it rest in peace, and may we all remember what happens when self-importance meets real property law." The crowd lost it. Some people clapped. Some laughed. A few gasped. Terry buried his face in his hands, probably wondering if he'd ever get re-elected. But it was too late. The moment went viral within minutes. Someone filmed it and posted it on the neighborhood Facebook page. A local satire blog picked it up. Even the county newsletter ran a short piece titled, "How One Man Ended a Trail War with Goats and Law Degrees." But the real kicker came 2 weeks later, when I received a letter from the County Environmental Board. It congratulated me on my creative outreach work, and invited me to serve as a volunteer advisor for future land use dispute. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. They wanted me to teach others how to deal with entitled bureaucrats and weaponized community boards. I accepted. Because why not? At that point, I'd turned a nuisance fine into a legal landmark, a trail closure into an educational campaign, and an HOA feud into a story half the county now knew by heart. I had people emailing me from other neighborhoods asking how to Cynthia-proof their bylaws. One guy even offered to pay me to consult on a lawsuit against his HOA for trying to dictate the color of his mailbox. As for Cynthia, no one's seen her in months. Rumor has it she moved to a gated community 2 counties over, one with stricter covenants and no trail system. Poetic. The trail was officially decommissioned. The HOA's records now list it as inactive, and the overgrown path has since been reclaimed by nature. It's quiet now, peaceful, and every so often, when I take my ATV out along the ridge and look down at the tangle of vines and thorns where her arch used to be, I smile. Because this whole saga started with a fine. But it's going to end with fireworks. I found it in my mailbox on a calm Tuesday afternoon, tucked inside a nondescript envelope with the HOA's letterhead stamped at the top like a warning label. The font was different, the paper heavier. It read like an obituary for sanity. Apparently, a small but concerned group of residents had proposed a reinstatement of limited trail access under the guise of a heritage project. And not just access. They wanted to restore the old trail, including vehicle access for maintenance, right through my property. Again. This was no coincidence. The group's new spokesperson? A freshly minted board member named Meredith Knock. She was Cynthia in a different shade, less shrill, more passive-aggressive, with an uncanny ability to weaponize politeness. She wore lavender and pearls, brought homemade muffins to meetings, and spoke in phrases like civic healing and restoring community traditions. I knew her type the moment I saw her name. Meredith had gathered a coalition of nostalgia addicts and suburban sentimentalists who missed their peaceful walks and spiritual connection to the land. Her proposal was deceptively gentle, filled with words like meditative, inclusive, and non-invasive. The memo concluded with a request to meet and collaboratively discuss the path forward. That's when I realized they weren't done. Cynthia had lit the fire. Meredith was just here to sell the ashes as incense. So I decided to give them a show. The board scheduled a public forum to vote on the Heritage Path Revival Initiative, which sounded like a bad folk band but was, in fact, a formal attempt to override the existing ecological designation and begin restoration planning. They needed a simple majority to pass the motion. I needed one evening to make sure they didn't. I walked into the meeting with a duffel bag. Inside it was everything I'd need to drive a stake through the heart of this HOA fever dream once and for all. The clubhouse was packed. More than 50 residents, some in support of the trail, some just there for the drama. Terry sat in his usual place, worn and wary. Meredith stood at the front, all smiles and serene smugness, thanking people for attending and handing out printed pamphlets. Then it was my turn to speak. I stepped up to the podium, unzipped my bag, and pulled out a drone, compact, lightweight, and loaded with footage I'd taken over the past month. I'd spent my weekends documenting the natural regrowth around the trail corridor. Time-lapse of birds nesting in the overgrown shrubs. Close-ups of native plants sprouting where gravel used to be. Footage of fox kits playing in the thicket. And then I played the final clip. A hawk landing on the rotted remnants of Cynthia's old wooden arch. I didn't say a word for the first 2 minutes. Just let the images roll. Then I looked at the crowd and said, "You want heritage? This is it. Not benches and painted rock. Not sound ordinances or paper fines. This. Wild. Alive. And finally undisturbed." There was a moment of silence. Meredith's expression hardened behind her polite mask. I could feel her gearing up to counter, probably with something saccharine and veiled, but I didn't give her the chance. I pulled out the second item in my bag, a thick manila folder. I handed it to the board. Inside are copies of new land trust paperwork. I've placed the entire corridor, including my properties section, under a 99-year conservation easement. It's been signed, filed, and approved by the county. As of this morning, any attempt to pave, maintain, or alter the landscape without full ecological review is not only illegal, it's prosecutable. Gasp. Actual gasp. I wasn't bluffing. I'd been working with a regional conservation group for months, quietly, behind the scenes, preparing this exact contingency. The easement now legally protected the entire former trail zone from development. Not just from HOA activity, but from any kind of future exploitation. The only thing allowed now? Watching it grow. Meredith tried to pivot. She began to speak, something about the community's emotional connection, but I cut her off, calm and precise. This community voted to fine me for using my own land. They tried to control it, pave through it, name it after themselves, and punish anyone who stood in the way. You called it a trail. I called it a battlefield. Now, it's a sanctuary. The board voted unanimously to withdraw the proposal. No one spoke as I packed up my bag and walked out of the clubhouse. It was done. Not just the fine, not just the trail, not just Cynthia's little kingdom, but the very idea that the HOA could ever claim that land again. The following weekend, I held a different kind of event. No stages, no speeches. Just an open invitation to anyone who wanted to see the land. Not hike it, not picnic on it, but truly see it. I called it a silent walk. People showed up. Not a ton. But enough. Some neighbors who'd previously signed Cynthia's petitions. A few who used to avoid me at the mailbox. They came, walked slowly through the narrow outer paths I'd marked, and left quietly. Most didn't say a word. But I saw something shift. Something subtle. They understood now. Some things aren't just property lines or bylaws. Some places are meant to be left alone. And the final twist? A week after the silent walk, I received an official letter from the local university's ecology department. A grad student had come to the event and wanted to study the area for her thesis on suburban rewilding. She asked if she could place observation markers on the property line. Nothing invasive, just remote sensors to track species activity and migration patterns. I agreed immediately. I told her the story. She laughed so hard she cried. Now, the trail once known for HOA micromanagement would become a case study in community collapse, overreach, and regeneration. Fitting. A few months later, I passed Terry at the farmer's market. He nodded at me, then said, "You turned a fine into a forest." "Not bad," I said. Next time, tell your HOA to pick on someone who doesn't read land deeds for fun. He laughed. A real one, not the nervous kind. As for Cynthia, I heard through the grapevine she joined a new HOA in her gated community, and tried to outlaw solar panels because they ruin the aesthetic of the clouds. Some people never change. Meredith? She quietly stepped down after the vote. Claimed she needed to focus on wellness. She left behind a flower planter and a weekly email newsletter no one reads anymore. My ATV still runs like a dream. I still ride it every Saturday. And every time I gun the engine and hear the echo bounce through the silent trees where that trail used to be, I smile. Not because I won, but because I outlasted them. I outmaneuvered them. I let them build their little empire of mulch and fairy lights, and then I let nature reclaim it while they watched. In the end, the trail didn't just disappear. It bloomed.